The wagon wheels stopped turning in a place where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. It was the last week of October, though nothing about the heat suggested any season had ended. The land lay flat in every direction, broken only by the distant tree line that marked the Louisiana border, and, closer, by the low brick chimney of the sugar mill, exhaling its thin gray smoke into a sky the color of weak tea. He climbed down first, boots sinking into ground still soft from a summer of rain, and reached up to help her down beside him. She had imagined this moment for months, the two of them standing on soil that belonged to no one else, no landlord, no father, no war debt hanging over their heads. She had pictured turned earth, maybe a stand of volunteer cane grass, something green and forgiving. What she saw instead made her hand tighten around his arm. Half the field shone black. Not the rich black of good bottomland, the kind her grandmother used to press between her fingers and call a blessing, but a wet, tar-dark sheen that caught the weak sunlight and threw it back distorted, like oil on a puddle. It spread from the property line nearest the mill in long, uneven tongues, pooling in the low places, crusting at the edges where the sun had baked it into something like scorched sugar candy left too long over a fire. "That wasn't in the claim papers," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She said nothing at first. She walked forward a few steps, careful, testing the ground with the toe of her boot the way she might test ice on a pond. It gave a little sticky, and released her with a faint sucking sound. The smell reached her then, burnt sweetness, thick and cloying, not unlike caramel gone to ruin in a pan left too long unattended. Behind them, the mill's tall stack kept breathing smoke into the flat gray afternoon, indifferent, as it must have been for years while this waste crept across what was supposed to be their future. He crouched at the edge of the blackened ground, running his fingers through the crust, watching it crumble and cling. 34 years old, and he had broken sod before, cleared brush, fought drought, but he had never seen a field poisoned like this, deliberately, by a neighbor who had simply found it convenient to have somewhere to put what his mill did not want. 6 years married, she said softly, staring out at the ruins spreading before them, and I thought we'd finally landed somewhere solid. He rose and stood beside her, and together they looked at the wreck of what the land office had called good acreage, a homestead claim half swallowed by scorched sugar waste, with winter coming on and a note at the bank waiting to be paid, and no way yet of knowing that the very poison darkening their ground might, in time, be the thing that saved it. The mill foreman came upon them that way, standing at the edge of their own ruined field, like mourners at a grave not yet dug. He was an older man, thick through the shoulders from decades of hauling cane, his face weathered the color of the very stack behind him. He carried no apology in his walk, only the slow, deliberate gait of a man accustomed to delivering bad news and letting it land where it would. "You'll want to leave that ground be," he said, without greeting, nodding toward the blackened crust. "Been dumping skimmings there since before the last owner gave up his claim. Ground won't grow nothing after that. Won't grow nothing for years, most like." She turned to him, and he saw something tighten in her jaw, though her voice stayed even. "Years," she repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. "Could be longer," the foreman said, unmoved. "Scorched sugar waste. It don't wash out easy. Sits in the soil, chokes it. Killed a stand of cotton 2 counties over, way I heard it told. Man there tried to farm through it, lost the whole crop, then lost the land besides." He spat to the side, not unkindly, simply as punctuation. "You'd do better to let the claim go before winter sets in. No sense fighting ground that's already lost. Silas felt the cold of the words settle into him deeper than the actual chill of the afternoon. He looked past the foreman to the mill itself, its stack breathing steady and untroubled, and thought of all the seasons it must have poured its ruin here before anyone had thought to claim this patch of earth for a home. "The mill's been using this ground a long while then," he said. "Not quite a question. Since before my time," the foreman answered. "Nobody wanted it. Convenient. Having somewhere close to put what comes off the boiling. Didn't figure anybody'd file on it." He shrugged, as if the injustice of it were simply weather, nothing to be argued with. "You want my advice, you'll find another parcel. Plenty of open land west of here that hasn't been fouled." Ruth said nothing for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the dark, cooling crust beneath their boots. Silas watched her, waiting, the way he had learned to wait through 6 years of marriage, through the hard frost that took their first garden, through the fever that nearly took her the winter before last. She had never yet been the one to speak of giving up, and he found himself hoping, almost desperately, that she would not begin now. The foreman touched the brim of his hat, satisfied he had done his duty by warning them, and turned back toward the mill, his boots leaving no mark on ground already too ruined to hold one. Behind him the smoke went on rising, indifferent, into a sky already gathering toward an early winter dusk. Winter came on slow that year, the way it always did along the border country, with mornings of gray fog that clung to the cane stubble across the fence line, and afternoons of thin, watery sunlight that never quite warmed the boards of the cabin. He spent those weeks with his hands raw from patching the roof, where the old shingles had curled and split, driving new pegs into gaps that let the wind whistle through at night. She stitched the quilt batting thicker with whatever wool scraps she could trade for at the mercantile, and together they stuffed rags and dried moss into the chinks between the logs, working in silence, broken only by the tap of the hammer and the wind moving low across the flat land. Supplies stretched thinner than either of them said aloud. The flour barrel showed its bottom by the second week of December, and the salt pork went further when cut smaller than either of them liked. She rationed coffee to Sunday mornings only, and he told himself he did not mind, though he watched the tin canister with a longing he was ashamed of. They ate what the garden had given before the frost took it, and what game he could bring in with patience rather than luck, since shells for the rifle were another thing that could not be spared. Each evening before the lamp was lit, one or the other of them would walk to the fence line and look out at the field, black as a spilled inkpot even under snow, and say nothing. The crust had not softened. If anything, the cold had hardened it further, sealing whatever lay beneath under a shell that gave back no answer to boot heel or spade. Ruth would stand there longer than Silas liked, her shawl drawn tight, her breath fogging the air, and he understood that she was doing arithmetic in her head that had nothing to do with numbers, counting instead the seasons, the strength left in her hands, the years they had already spent proving themselves to land that gave grudgingly even when it gave at all. The banker's note sat folded in the tin box on the shelf, and neither of them opened it more than they had to, though both knew the date written across its face as well as they knew each other's voices. Come spring, the first payment would be due, and there was nothing yet growing on their claim that could answer for it. Silas told her, more than once, that something would come to them, some way through, the way there always had been before. She would nod and lean her head briefly against his shoulder in the cold dark of the doorway, and neither of them believed it entirely, but neither of them said so. The banker came on a Tuesday, when the frost had lifted just enough to let his buggy wheels find purchase on the rutted lane. He did not send word ahead, and later she would say she was glad of it, for there had been no time to arrange the place into something it was not. He stepped down in his good coat, the hem already darkening where it brushed the black-crusted ground, and he stood a long moment surveying the field the way a man might survey a body he expected to bury. He walked its edges without being asked, prodding at the shell of scorched waste with the tip of his cane, and the sound it made, a hollow, sucking crack, seemed to satisfy something in him that words could not have. He said little at first. He asked how many acres lay ruined, and when she told him, he wrote the number in a small book he carried, as though it were evidence for a court that had already decided the verdict. It was only when he turned back toward the buggy that he spoke plainly. He said he had seen land go bad before, seen it more times than he cared to count, and that in every case the ground had looked much as this ground looked now, dark, dead, sealed against the plow. He said the bank had not loaned against a field to watch it become a tar pit, and that he could not in conscience extend further patience to a claim that showed no promise of ever answering its note. He mentioned the date written on the paper in the tin box as though he too had memorized it, and perhaps he had. Silas answered him steady, though his jaw was tight, saying the mill's waste had not been their doing, and the season was not yet done for judging what the land could bear. The banker did not argue the point so much as let it fall away unanswered, the way a man lets a coin drop that he has already decided is not worth the stooping. He said only that he would return before planting, and that what he found then would settle the matter one way or the other. He climbed back into the buggy without further ceremony, and they watched him go, the wheels leaving twin black smears where they had crossed the worst of the crust, before finding cleaner ground beyond the fence line. Neither of them spoke for a while after the sound of the horse had faded past the tree line. She stood with her arms crossed against the chill, looking at the field as though it might, in the silence, offer up some answer of its own. Silas finally said that a man who judged land by its worst season had never farmed a day in his life, and she almost laughed, though the sound caught somewhere short of her throat, and what came out instead was closer to a breath held too long, finally let go. That night the cabin held its quiet, the way a well holds water, still and deep and giving nothing back. He slept early, worn through from the digging he had done that day, for no reason but to have something to do with his hands, and she lay beside him listening to the wind work at the shutters, thinking of the field the way a person thinks of a wound they have been told will not heal. She did not mean to remember her grandmother. It came to her sideways, the way old things do, brought on by nothing more than the smell of smoke, drifting faint from the banked coals, a smell not unlike the scorched sweetness that clung to the black ground outside. She had been a girl then, no older than 8 or 9, sent each summer to the cane country below the river where her grandmother kept a garden that seemed to thrive on nothing but stubbornness and heat. She remembered the old woman's hands, dark and cracked as dry creek bed, laying out strips of burnt sugar skimmings along the garden's edge each spring, murmuring about worms that came up out of the ground hungry in the dark, and found the sweetness before they found the beans. She had asked why the worms did not simply eat the skimmings and grow fat on them, and her grandmother had laughed the short laugh of someone who found a child's question wiser than she expected, and said the sugar was burnt past nourishing, that it drew the creatures same as any bait draws a fish, only there was no hook needed, for the heat left in it, and the sticking of it did the rest. The worms went to it and did not come back from it. The garden lived, because the ruin at its edge did the dying for it. She lay very still after the memory settled, feeling something in her chest that was not quite hope, not yet, but was no longer only despair either. It was closer to the feeling of finding a tool she had forgotten she owned, half buried, its use not yet clear but its shape familiar in the hand. She thought of the field outside, black and reeking, and pronounced dead by every man who had looked at it, and wondered if a thing called poison in one season might be called by a kinder word in another, if it were only made to serve rather than simply endured. She did not wake him. It was not yet a plan, only a seed of one, and she wanted to turn it over alone a while longer before she gave it breath, the way a farmer turns a stone in his palm before deciding whether it is worth the trouble of building around or the trouble of hauling away. Spring came to the border country the way it always did in that flat green land, not gently, but all at once, as if the earth had been holding its breath through the gray months and let it out in a single warm rush that brought the frogs singing in the ditches and the mosquitoes rising from the standing water and the cane stalks pushing up pale and eager in the mill's long rows. With the warmth came the talk, carried down the road by wagon and on foot, the way all news traveled in that country, slow and certain as water finding its level. The talk was of cutworms. She heard it first from the peddler who came through with his cart of tin and thread, who said the Hendricks place 2 farms over had lost near half its new corn shoots in a single week, the worms coming up out of the ground at night to gnaw the tender stalks clean through at the base, so that a man would go out at dawn and find his whole planting lying flat as if scythed. She heard it again from the woman at the mill store, who said the same blight had struck the Pruitt land and the widow Sarnat's garden, and was creeping toward the county road like a slow gray fire nobody could see until it had already passed. She said nothing of it to him for 2 days, turning the news over alongside the memory that had come to her in the night, testing whether the two fit together the way she suspected they might, the way a woman tests a key in a lock she is not yet sure is the right door. But on the 3rd evening, with the supper dishes cleared and the lamp turned low, she told him plainly of the worms eating the county's plantings, and of her grandmother's trick from the cane parishes, the scorched skimmings laid out to draw the worms and hold them and let the heat and the sugar do what no hoe or hand-picking ever could. He listened the way he listened to most things she brought him, without interrupting, his hands still on the table before him, his eyes on her face rather than on the window where the black field lay waiting in the dark. When she finished, he did not answer at once. He turned it over the way he turned over a tool before trusting it to a task, weighing the shape of the idea against the weight of everything the foreman and the banker had told them about that ground. "If it's true," he said slowly, "it's the first kind word anybody's spoken about that field since we signed for it." She did not say it would work. She only said it was worth trying, on their own ruined acres first, where nothing more could be lost. He was quiet a long moment, and then he nodded, cautious but not closed, the way a man nods who has decided to hope a little before he has decided to believe. He rose before the light did, as he had every morning since the note came due, but this morning he did not sit long at the table with his coffee going cold in his hands. He walked out into the gray hour when the mist still clung low over the cane rows on the mill side of the fence, and he stood at the edge of their own scorched ground with his boots sinking a little into the char, and he looked at it the way he had once looked at a green field before he'd ever put a plow to it, not as ruin, but as a thing waiting to be shaped. The black stretched wide and shapeless, spread by rain and wind and the careless dumping of the mill carts, soaking into low places and pooling where the land dipped, killing without pattern or purpose. That was the trouble with it, he thought. It had no order. A man could not use a thing that had no order. He crouched at the near edge and dragged his thumb through the crust of it, feeling the grit of scorched sugar beneath the sheen, and he began, without a spade yet in his hand, to see lines. Not the wide, senseless spread of it now, but narrow channels, no wider than a hoe blade, cut shallow along the border where the worms would come up out of the grass hunting green shoots. He pictured it the way he pictured a roof before he framed it, the water finding its own way if you gave it a path, the skimmings drawn off from the wasted middle ground and laid instead in thin, deliberate strips, walled by low ridges of packed earth, so the black could not wander where it wasn't wanted. He walked the field twice more before the sun cleared the tree line, pacing off distances with his boot heels, marking turns with broken cane stalks he found blown over the fence, and by the time Ruth came out with her shawl pulled close against the morning chill, he had the whole shape of it laid out in his mind, though nothing yet on the ground to show for it but his own tracks crossing and recrossing the ruined dirt. "You've been out here an hour," she said, not quite a question. "Studying it," he answered, and pointed with his chin toward the low run of ground nearest the fence line. "If I cut here, and here, it'll carry itself where I want it. Won't need to fight the whole field at once. Just the edges, just where they'd come hunting." She stood beside him and looked where he looked, and for the first time since the black had come, the ruined ground did not look to her like something dead. It looked like something waiting on a shovel. He fetched the shovel from where it leaned against the barn and began where he had marked, driving the blade into ground that had gone hard and strange since the black had settled into it. The dirt did not break the way honest dirt broke. It resisted in clumps, sticky even weeks on, and came up in dark wedges that smelled faintly of burnt sugar when the sun struck them. He did not complain of it. He set his boot to the shovel's shoulder and pressed down, and when the first trench opened along the fence line, shallow and straight as a plow furrow, he stood back and looked at it the way a man looks at a sentence he has written correctly. She worked behind him with a wooden paddle and an old tin pail, scraping the thickest of the skimmings from where they had pooled, and carrying them to the trenches he cut, laying them in strips no wider than a hand's spread, careful not to let the black creep past the low ridges of packed earth he'd built to hold it. Her arms ached by mid-morning, the muscle low in her back complaining with every bend, but she did not slow, and he did not ask her to. They had found, without saying so, a rhythm that needed no words. His shovel biting into ground a few strides ahead, her paddle following to fill what he'd opened, the two of them moving down the fence line like some slow two-part machine built out of hunger and hope rather than iron. The sun rose higher and turned the black strips slick and faintly steaming where the heat touched them, and gnats gathered thick over the sweetness of it, and still they worked, pausing only when she brought water from the well in a chipped crock, and they drank standing, shoulder to shoulder, looking back at what they had made. By the second day, the fence-line trenches had grown into a rough network, branching where the ground dipped, narrowing where it rose, each strip walled just enough to keep the skimmings from spreading wild the way they had spread before, back when the mill's wagons had simply tipped their loads and let ruin go where it pleased. On the third day she began setting small stakes at the trench edges, broken bits of cane, notched with her thumbnail, so they could mark, without speaking of it aloud, which strips had drawn the most black and which had drawn none. He noticed the stakes and said nothing, only nodded once, and moved his shovel to open a new line where her marks told him the ground wanted watching. Neither of them spoke of the banker, or the foreman, or the season slipping toward planting time with nothing yet proven. There was only the digging, the laying, the slow blackened miles of their own 2 acres, and between them a wordless faith that the ruined ground, worked patiently enough, might yet be made to answer for itself. The proof came on a morning so still that the frost had not yet lifted from the fence rails when she walked out ahead of him, lantern still burning pale against the graying dark, to check the strips nearest the old cane border. She stopped so suddenly that he nearly walked into her from behind, and when he looked past her shoulder he saw what had stopped her breath. The black bait strip along the western trench lay dotted thick with the curled, sluggish bodies of cutworms, more than either of them had ever seen gathered in one place, caught fast in the cooling scorch of the skimmings like flies pressed into wax. Some were already still, others twisted weakly, mired past escaping, the sticky black holding them the way it had held nothing else all winter but their own worry. She knelt without minding the damp hem of her skirt and counted them under her breath, moving her fingers stake by stake, and he crouched beside her and counted the same row again, to be certain neither of them had wanted the number badly enough to invent it. 41 in the first strip alone. Near 60 in the second, where the trench ran narrower and the skimmings had pooled deeper. In the strips she had cut to catch the runoff before it could spread past the border, the ground beyond stood untouched, pale and ordinary, no black bleeding into the soil that fed their winter greens. They did not celebrate. They worked. She fetched the ledger book kept for feed and seed and began a new page, dating it plainly, marking each strip by her cane stakes and setting down the count beside it, morning after morning, so that the numbers themselves might speak later to men who trusted figures more than they trusted a farmwife's word. He measured the trenches again with a length of knotted twine, recording the depth and the distance from the planted rows, wanting to know exactly what ground had done the work and what had merely watched. By the fifth morning the pattern held steady enough that neither of them could call it chance. The worms came to the black in numbers no hand-picking or lye water had ever matched, and where they came, they did not leave living. Still they said little of it beyond the counting itself, as if speaking hope aloud might spend it before it was ready. But in the evenings, working by firelight over the ledger, she began sketching the trench lines from memory, marking which turns had gathered the most, and he watched her hand move across the page the way he'd once watched her plan a garden from nothing but a seed catalogue and faith, and something in him loosened, just slightly, toward believing the ruined ground might answer for itself after all. It was a Tuesday when the first wagon came up the lane, drawn slow by a mule gone thin at the ribs, and the man who climbed down from it had the look of someone who had already tried every remedy he knew and found none of them worth the trying twice. He stood at the fence a long while before he spoke, turning his hat in his hands, and when the words came they came plain and low, the way a man asks for something he is ashamed to need. His east field was going the way of every other field in the district, the young corn eaten to stubs before it had a chance to stand, and he had heard, from where he could not rightly say, only that talk moved faster than truth in a settlement this small, that the black ground on the Mabry place had stopped the worms cold. She did not promise him miracles. She told him what she knew, plainly, the way her grandmother might have told it to a doubting neighbor decades before in another state, another kitchen. He listened, nodded slower than he needed to, and asked when they might come. They went the next morning, taking the mule cart loaded with shovels and a barrel of the skimmings scraped fresh from the mill's runoff ditch, the foreman having grumbled but not refused when Silas asked to haul it off rather than let it sit and stink in the sun. They cut the trenches along the field's worst edge, shallow and careful, just as they had learned to cut them on their own ground, and laid the black bait in narrow ribbons where the corn rows met the fence line. The farmer watched with his arms crossed, unconvinced, the posture of a man who had spent good hope on worse ideas before. By the fourth day, he was no longer watching from a distance. He was on his knees beside the trench with his own hands blackened, counting the dead the way Ruth had shown him, marking the tally on a shingle with a nub of charcoal, and when the numbers climbed the way they had climbed on the Mabry field, something in his face opened that had been closed the whole visit. Word of it did not travel loud. It traveled the way such things travel in a small place, a mention over a fence post, a nod exchanged after church, a wife telling another wife while hanging wash. But it traveled steady, and within the week 2 more men had come asking, hats in hand, the same shame and the same hope moving through them both, and Ruth and Silas found themselves, without quite deciding it, become the people the settlement turned to when the ground itself seemed to be losing. By midsummer, the cart tracks between the homestead and the surrounding farms had worn into a plain, honest road, packed hard by the wagons that came for the black remedy in tin pails and old feed sacks. Silas kept a ledger in a hand that grew steadier with each entry, and the coins he set aside in the coffee tin by the hearth made a sound Ruth had come to love, small and certain, like rain finding a roof for the first time in a dry season. The corn stood taller on the treated fields. The talk in town shifted from pity to something closer to respect, though it came slow and grudging, the way respect from cautious men always does. It was the banker's own foreman who arrived first, standing awkward at the fence with his hat turned in his hands, saying the family's cane and corn both had taken to dying at the root, and that the man he worked for had sent him quiet, not wanting it known just yet that his own ground had failed him. Silas said nothing of the irony. He only nodded and gathered his tools. But it was the banker himself who came 2 days later, riding out alone in the heat of the afternoon, his coat dusty, his face set in the same stern lines he wore at his desk when he spoke of notes and deadlines. He did not dismount right away. He sat looking at the field that had once been scorched and ruined under his own judgment, now dark and productive in a way he had sworn was impossible, and something in his throat seemed to catch before he spoke. He said his family's farm was dying by inches, that the worms had come up through the soil like a curse, and that he had tried what other men tried and failed, and that he had heard, reluctant, as if the words cost him something, that the Mabrys might know a way. Ruth answered before Silas could, her voice even, offering him the same courtesy she gave every worried farmer who came to their gate. She told him they would come. He nodded once, sharp, and turned his horse before either of them could see whatever crossed his face next. That evening, Silas dug longer than usual, the lamp burning late in the window, and Ruth stood in the doorway watching the shape of him work against the dark, thinking of the notice still folded in the drawer, the ink not yet faded, the threat not yet withdrawn. She did not say what she was thinking. She only carried out a cup of coffee and set it beside him, and together they looked toward the road that would carry them, come morning, onto the very land of the man who had once called their ground worthless. The banker's fields lay east of town, where the creek bent twice before losing itself in cane country, and when they arrived, the ground told its own story before anyone spoke a word. Furrows chewed hollow, seedlings toppled like small soldiers, the black earth beneath them writhing with the same pale worms that had once threatened to take everything they owned. He stood at the fence rail with his hat in his hands, not his banker's coat but a farmer's coat, patched at the elbow, and he watched them work without a word of instruction, only watching, the way a man watches something he does not yet believe in. They laid the trenches the way they always did, now, shallow and patient, The skimmings poured dark and glistening along the bait strips at the field's edge, and by the second morning the worms had come to the black ground the way moths come to flame, drawn and doomed, dying in numbers that left the banker silent for a long while before he finally spoke. He said he did not know what to make of a thing that ruined one man's ground and saved another's, and Ruth told him it was not ruin at all, only waste that had never been given its proper use, and that the difference between poison and remedy was sometimes only a matter of where a man was willing to dig. He did not answer that day, but 3 days later he rode out to their homestead himself, dismounted without ceremony, and drew the folded notice from his coat. He tore it once, then again, and set the pieces in Silas's open hand, as if returning something borrowed too long. He said the note was settled, the claim was theirs outright, and that he would be sending his neighbors their way come spring. Then he mounted and rode off before either of them could thank him properly, though Ruth thought, watching him go, that the set of his shoulders looked lighter than it had in a year. That evening they walked out together to the old dumping ground, the field that had once been called worthless, now dark and quiet beneath the low autumn sun, cane stubble gold at its edges and blackened soil rich beneath their boots. Silas took her hand the way he had that first frightened winter, and Ruth leaned into him, watching the light fail slow and orange over land that had nearly cost them everything, and had instead given them a name, the people who had turned ruin into remedy. Neither of them spoke for a long while. There was no need. The ground beneath them, dark and living, said all that needed saying, and they stood there together until the first stars came, home in every way that mattered.